Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Exactly 44 years ago, with virtually no economic, social, or cultural relationship, China, the United States, out of respective security needs, embarked on the process of a normalization of their bilateral relations. Today, the China-US relationship has grown into the most complex bilateral international relationship in the world. Standing at a new point of departure in history, how should we assess the nature and the future of China-US ties? And how can we usher in an era of new thinking in international politics? Today, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Cheng Li, director of the John Thornton China Center and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He is also a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Bilateral relationships in today's world are never simple, especially between two of the world's biggest powers. Since U.S. President Barack Obama welcomed Chinese President Xi Jinping for a state visit last September, both nations have differed increasingly over militarization in the South China Sea. China has been building defensive measures on islands it has historically claimed, while in the past 5 months, the U.S. has twice sailed warships within 12 nautical miles of the contested islands.
We're not out to keep China down, but we don't look for anybody to dominate the region, and certainly not anybody to push the United States out. We are a Pacific power. We're there to stay.
China urges the United States to stop sensationalizing and hyping up, stop threatening words and actions, respect the efforts made by countries in the region to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea.
But when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in Washington in February, cooperation was on display. The pair celebrated their common ground on addressing climate change, and both diplomats were united on stiffer penalties for the DPRK's nuclear test and rocket launch earlier this year.
These violations not only threaten the peninsula, but they are also a threat to international peace and security. We therefore need to respond accordingly, and we agreed today to continue our efforts to make certain our response is forthcoming rapidly.
Those violations threaten not only the peninsula, but they also are a threat to international peace and security. We therefore need to respond accordingly, and we agreed today to continue our efforts to make certain that response is forthcoming rapidly.
Chinese and American diplomats worked behind the scenes to reach a draft resolution for the United Nations Security Council to toughen sanctions against the DPRK. In early March, it was passed unanimously. So you may think the two sides are entering a new honeymoon in their relationship. Well, here is how U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter put it a couple of days ago. It is clear that the U.S.-China relationship will be complex as we continue to balance our competition and cooperation.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir. You are the first Chinese-American to lead the Brookings Institution John Thornton China Center on China and from China. How does your perspective on today's China tend to differ from those of other Chinese or Americans who study the same subject matters?
Well, this is precisely the two terms you use, Chinese and American. I'm not only a Chinese because of this is my home country, the native country. Then I become an American citizen. So I'm a Chinese American, not just Chinese, not just American. That gives me a great privilege to have a relatively better understanding of my native country and my adopted country. And also I try to use that privilege to try to use the language that Chinese understand to explain American foreign policy, American policy toward China. The same things, use the language or the ideas or notions that Americans are familiar with to introduce China and China's changes and China's continuity, Chinese culture, politics, economy. So that's given me tremendous privilege. And so I'm honored to have that kind of opportunity to play that very important role as a cultural bridge, like many other Chinese Americans.
You, I'm afraid, do have some reasonable problems to fix before you could live up to the expectations of your American counterparts or colleagues. For example, China is still called the communist regime. Therefore, we tend to have the ideological lens employed by Americans and Europeans in examining the new realities in China. almost 4 decades after China decided to open itself up. So, other than this barrier in a way that may prevent you from projecting and presenting an objective account of what's really happening here, what are the other problems you have to solve before you could, present a complete picture?
Well, of course, that Americans, and sometimes because of its own strengths, they tend to have an inward looking. And sometimes it's partly it's about arrogance, partly because of ignorance of the outside world. So as an Chinese American or as an American, I think it's our responsibility and to tell what's going on in the outside world. And especially that if America wants to maintain its leadership or its positive role in the ever-changing world, we should have a better understanding of the outside world. So inward looking only will undermine American interests and also will lead to some policy mistakes. I think this is the view actually is shared by many cultural, educational or academic elites. I wish that we would do more, and certainly the fact that Americans has a kind of a poor understanding of the outside world, it's reflect the work we have been doing is really still not. We should do more to change that. But on the other hand, I think through our work, through Chinese own change, and we Americans do understand that to call communist China is not appropriate. And so China is a paradox of many different things, rich and poor, old and modern, communist and capitalist, and free-willing and bureaucratic, and etc. You can see the numerous contradictions, and certainly the paradox of communist and capitalist is one of them.
That's very interesting and enlightening to hear an expert of your ranking to clarify some of the confusion here. Now, China is obviously standing at the crossroad and the point of departure. We find it very difficult to transform ourselves from the old institutions into something that is closer to the international standards, because partly those in power are very reluctant to accept what are called universal values. Therefore, it is very difficult for a country like the United States to accept the emergence of a new power. Now, from your point of view, what is the core problem that prevents the Chinese leadership from accepting something which is called universal? And some of the Chinese elites, and many of them are my friends, even question seriously the legitimacy of universal values. That may be a serious obstacle in the way of our mutual communication, effective mutual communication.
Well, you made a very good point, but first let me clarify. Some Chinese leaders do talk about universal values, and for example, former President Wen Jiabao talked a number of times about the importance of universal values. To a certain extent, Xi Jinping's concept of Chinese dream, particularly he made comparison between Chinese dream and American dream. He talked about commonality and the shared aspiration to have a middle class life, and for peace, for prosperity. These are quite common. So it's very close to towards a universal value concept. But of course, there's some legitimate concern by some people that Westerners use that it's a moral superiority or even some ideology to impose other countries. But this is less important in my view. But I think that we do need to talk about some of the common things. And Xi Jinping's the common destiny itself also reflect some of the shared aspiration. Now, in terms of what he said early on, that Americans are afraid of rising China, yes, there's some components based on misunderstanding or fear and etc. But the majority of Americans, I think, and especially American elites, they already see China has emerged as a great power. As at the beginning of your program mentioned, that you cannot imagine 44 years ago, even 20 years ago, to witness China become the second largest economy. Most Americans actually will say probably China is already the largest economy, right? So this is not something, they should be feared, because they think it's also part of reality. And some of the Americans, particularly more sophisticated Americans, Americans think that we should learn lessons from China's success. Of course, China is not perfect. China has some serious problems in terms of the environment pollution, economic disparity, but the United States also has some problem. I think basically when we talk about rebalance of the economy, it's China should save less and consume more. America just the opposite, should consume less and save more. Then the global economy will be much balanced way.
You know, Cheng Li, I'm very glad you came up with the issue on the middle class. Now, I wonder if you, and you also mentioned that Xi Jinping, our President Xi Jinping, emphasized the importance of highlighting the commonality between the two alien cultures, the United States and Chinese. Let's look at the issue of middle class. Many scholars and economists argue that China has entered into the ranking of a middle-income economy. And that means we have a big army of middle-class people. I don't know whether they could be called the silent majority politically, because that has a very clear political connotational meaning. Other than this, what are the commonality issues and what are the differences that may prevent people like you from employing the same approach in examining the challenges that the middle class faces and also the opportunities that we may have in the new era? For example, in China for centuries, the officialdom, the word officialdom or government officials are labeled a rational instrument, a very important word in political science to serve the supremacy of the rulers. They are known for loyalty in the bureaucratic apparatus, and that played a pivotal role in consolidating the power base of the royal families for centuries and in so many dynasties. Today, these people allegedly still carry some of the hallmarks of the officialdom through 科举考试, you know, also a kind of a national examination in the past. I can spend hours talking about the hallmarks and the characteristics of what used to be called the Rusheng, the Confucius bureaucrats, and they laid the foundation or groundwork for the ruling class. Today, in review of the history and looking into the future, what do you think of the growing importance of the middle class?
Well, so no
in my country, of course.
No issue or no social group has more, consequential role than the middle class. It will shape China's future and shape China's image in the international community. It's interesting to point out that when I came back to China, in early 1990s, as a visiting scholar at the Fudan and the Shanghai Institute of International Affairs, I wrote a book talking about the emergence of middle class in Shanghai. This is largely about the middle 1990s. When I returned to the United States, tried to publish that book, but the book was rejected many, many times because all the reviewers said that the term middle class was misleading. China had only a very small number of rich, powerful people, a huge majority of poor people. So that was the middle 1990s and later 1990s. But of course now people all talk about middle class because middle class is changing the global economy. And China, according to the later Lu Xueyi, sociologist in China, 4 years ago, China had a total of 247 million middle class members. And Xi Jinping recently said it's about 300 million. So it's roughly that's correct. This all make China to be the largest middle class country in the world.
Excuse me, you have to give a clear definition about the middle class in the universal sense, first of all, and then in the Chinese context, perhaps we have to add something else.
Absolutely, because actually not only difficult in terms of definition in Chinese context, but also difficult in every country's definition about the middle class. But in the context of China, scholars, which I agree, that usually use the categorization based on 4 criteria, and income, consumption, and occupation, and self-recognition. So, but the most important is the consumption. That's a very, very important criteria, but they're usually based on 4. Again, occupation, consumption, self-recognition, and occupation. So with that combination, we derived that the number about 247 million in Chinese context. But no matter what, that the consumption in China really changed the global economy. And also, of course, middle class at the moment is still mainly we talk about the social dimension, economic dimension, but of course there's a political impact. If you look at the United States, why American democracy maintain kind of quite a stable development? I think the middle class play a very, very important role. And also you look at the American presidential campaign, politicians, whether Republican or Democrat, always wanted to target the middle class. If they get popular among the middle class, they are the winners. So that's actually, it's a very, very important thing in the United States, but also assumably in China today and particularly in China's future.
No one denies the growing importance of the middle class, particularly in a transitional economy. However, the middle class has to be backed up by other pillar forces in the society, rule of law or the independence of the media. I wonder if those are the characteristics typical of a Western culture. But you are watching Dialogue with Mr. Cheng Li, Director of the John Thornton China Center and a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We've been discussing the role the middle class plays in ensuring smooth transformation of China, economic, political, and cultural alike. Do we share some of the common things, or you'd rather emphasize the uniqueness of the Chinese middle class in navigating our own course? Because as I said earlier in the first paragraph of the program, well-educated Chinese middle-class members are known for developing a profound sense of history and their sense of solidarity to maintain the absolute leadership of the Communist Party. Of course, this point is questioned more and more by liberals, because we have more of such liberal voices if you look at the broad spectrum of voices across the public opinions, the spectrum. What do you think?
Well, there are certain aspects are quite unique in China, because we really talk about middle class. It's a big basket, including political elites, because Chinese cadres, officials are part of middle class, most of them, and economic elites, entrepreneurs, rural and urban, business elites, and also cultural elites like journalists, professors, etc. So it's a quite diversified group. But this is also, to a certain extent, also in some other countries. But we do need to know that in China, this is a very big basket. Secondly, Chinese middle class is emerged in very relatively small period of time, short period of time. And also, Chinese middle class, by and large, do not want revolution. They want to have reform, gradual change. But also that the relationship between middle class and the ruling party is also changing. And as we know, that the Chinese government still use the term as middle income group, not to use a class concept. But more and more people, more and more scholars now also use that concept. Actually, that concept will communicate better with outside world. Because as I said early on, some foreigners, some scholars or politicians do not like the middle class because it makes them very much look like us, United States, the people. Therefore, you do not have the ideological superiority to criticize China and etc. But on the other hand, from Chinese perspective, this is the best way to make a point. China's rise, it will be peaceful rise. China's middle class will not only contribute to China's political, social, economic development, but also become part of the world as a stabilizing force. Middle class, and by and large, usually do not want a war, because this is a peaceful, so-called democratic peace is related with the middle class.
What do you think of the threats that the middle class may pose to social stability, acts of a color revolution?
Well, this is a very good point. Actually, Samuel Hunting tended to have a generalization arguing that the middle class usually in a given country were kind of quite revolutionary, quite critical, and try to change certain lots of things, then later become conservative. But this could be opposite in some of other countries. First, middle class become conservative early on, but then become satisfied and become the forces for change. So today's political allies could be tomorrow's political rivals. So I think the relationship is changing and also differ from country to country, from time to time. So I think that any leader should be careful if that you forget about the rule of law, forget about by nature middle class like media freedom, like transparency in the policy making process. They don't like corruption, so therefore middle class in general support the government to have a strong anti-corruption campaign. So again, middle class usually play a very important role to stabilizing the political system rather than have a kind of upside down or try to have a revolutionary approach. This is a general speak. So in that regard, I think the Chinese government should really to gradually make some important changes in various areas, political reform and social change, and also most importantly, rule of law, and also media openness. So this is the best way to make a middle class feel that their voice heard, their interests protected, and through the legal system. So I think that's a very important force for gradual social political change in a country such as China.
Many people here in China, observants for example, find themselves wrestling with the issue of justice and efficiency. So what do you think of our concerns?
Well, I think that a very good point. Actually, Americans' founding fathers, when they established American democracy, they actually had some, the bad governments are two sorts. One tried to do too much, one tried to do too little. Mm-hmm. So I think the important thing is balance. Someone said, efficiency and justice stand the best when stand together. But that's the ideal situation. In reality, there are a lot of tensions. So you have constantly to adjust your policy to, on the other hand, give freedom, give opportunity, but at the same time to help those disadvantaged. So I think all governments should concern about this challenge. This is not a unique Chinese challenge. Americans actually, for example, Brookings now, the most important research project is about inequality. Inequality in the American own society, inequality in today's world. So this is one of the most important projects for the next decade or beyond. So that tells you also that the common challenge that Americans face, just like the Chinese. So I think the important thing is a balance. There's no perfect, there's no ideal situation, but the government should constantly to monitor, and also general public should have a demand. So if society becomes pluralistic, which is China is moving that direction, so I think we see the interest groups wishing different voices, and they try to find their representative in the government. So this is what the representative government or democracy is all about.
Let's look at whether China and the United States can enjoy what President Xi Jinping calls a new type of major power relationship, particularly to usher in a new era of co-evolution. Co-evolution might be a little bit difficult for the United States because many of those in the States, as you said wisely, are enslaved by arrogance, superiority. But don't you think of the 21st century, it is the common responsibility for the United States and China to look at the issue collectively, like climate change, WMD, proliferation of WMD, and how to fight terrorism. You can name a few of those common challenges. Is it time, for example, to use China's wisdom, for example, in institutional building like AIIB, to renew the old ideological lens that is employed by the Americans in looking at the Chinese mode of development, and build new institutions to improve the existing international economic order, to say nothing of the very sensitive issue of international political order?
Well, absolutely. The upcoming G20 meeting in Hangzhou, and also in about 2 weeks, that actually less than 2 weeks, that the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington, D.C. reflects that the need for cooperation. I think that the world has changed. We should not use the Cold War mentality to look at today's world. Mm-hmm. Certainly should not go back to the 19th century way of thinking, because Einstein once said the nuclear weapon changed everything except the mindset. The same thing you can say economic globalization changed everything mindset. So we do need to find that in today's world, with high technology, with ever change of the global economic integration, we need to work together. So at the end of the day, all the leaders will think about what's the best choice. Have a confrontation on serious issues, on military issues, or just settle down these disputes through negotiation and compromise. And I think that it's not difficult to see what will serve your best interest.
The last question is very much about the upcoming G20 to be held in Hangzhou. What do you think of the ability of this host country to translate into reality and practice the theme of being inclusive, vigorous, interconnected, and what else? The keywords in the slogan.
This will be a milestone event if China serves as a great host country at the presidency of the G20, because it reflects two things. One is the developing country now have more say in global affairs, not just dominated by previously G7. Secondly, China become a real constructive member, stakeholder in global affairs. Now, China will not become that leader, certainly, but China will contribute contribute to the change or reform of the international system. And I think that the international system reform, whether economy, whether some other mechanism, is very much on the agenda. I hope that the G20, representing the large majority of the world, can play a very important role to move that direction. So therefore, will really contribute to peace and prosperity in today's world. Otherwise, I think that it will be a disaster in the making. So I applaud China play such an important role, and actually Brookings that we will host some event in China and also in the United States for that landmark event. We wish that that be successful. We also hope that China and the United States will really play a very positive role in helping the world moving to the right direction, avoid conflicts, avoid all the terrible things you just mentioned, in terms of cyber terrorism, in terms of the nuclear terrorism, and also many other challenges we face. And again, the stake is so high. I think all the major powers and should really understand what's our best interest. I think the answer is clear, and at least now the countries want to come together, and China's role will become increasingly important. So that is actually, again, it's a historical event for China. Again, we wish that become a very successful event, and it will be a landmark event for China's history, for cooperation and prosperity of the world.
With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.